good morning and welcome to Rising, and let there be light, because we are now in what, I don't remember if it's daylight savings time or undaylight savings time, whatever it is.
We've sprung forward.
We now have another hour of pleasant daylight in the evening, which I love. Sagar and Jetty, the former host of this show, is a vocal opponent of this regime. I think he believes that more sunny time in the evenings is bad for families and contributes to people like having a long happy hour or something. But I love happy hour and am very in favor of not, I hate when you leave the office and it's dark out already. It's terrible.
Not good.
So I'm in a pleasant mood. How about you?
That's what's elevated your spirits, Robby.
Temporarily.
I did not know there was this division of opinion on the right of daylight savings time. I am in equally good spirits and glad to get started with another busy day, busy week. So what is on your radar?
Well, we're going to end up fighting about this one, Niall. Let's get to it. One of the most frequently recurring revelations of the last several years is that the mainstream media is desperately out of touch with ordinary Americans. Our elite commentator class reflexively trusts the expert consensus, even when experts discredit themselves, as they did with COVID. The consensus wants to promote progressive social and cultural policies that vast majorities of people find deeply off-putting, and they display an endless appetite for American military interventionism in far-flung regions of the earth. The voters keep trying to tell the people in charge they just want America first. They want to be largely left alone. They don't want language and behavior overly policed. They want a social safety net and for government to, yes, prioritize fixing problems at home, not try to become the world policeman or send billions of dollars overseas for unclear reasons. But the MSM exists in a bubble, and so every time the majority of Americans speak up and make their priorities clear, the bubble briefly bursts, then is desperately reconstructed. I swear, every week there's some new poll showing that a majority of people agree with President Trump on some policy, foreign policy, the border, federal spending, etc. Each and every time, the media is shocked to learn this. Every time. Last week was no different. We've been assured over and over again by the media that what Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency are doing is very, very unpopular. Surely Americans are moved by the plight of the laid-off federal workers. Surely they think Elon is cutting vital government programs. People must want an end to this madness. This is not what they voted for. And on and on and on it goes. There's only one way to settle this, of course. Let's actually do a poll. CNN pollster Harry Enton, a mainstream media figure who actually just does his job and does it quite well, reports the facts that he gathers. Well, he parsed the numbers, and guess what? Take a look.
This, to me, was one of the more shocking figures that I saw. Made me go, wait a minute, hold on one second. Whoa! Americans on Trump and Joe's efforts. Musk and DOGE should influence government spending and operations. Look at this. 54%. The majority say that he and they should. How about approve of Trump trying to cut staff at government agencies? Again, you get a majority here. 51%. So yeah, Elon Musk might not be that popular, but these cuts and the idea of spending cuts, at least within the federal government and cutting at government agencies, that actually has majority support. I was truly surprised by this, Kate, but the numbers are the numbers.
Well, there is a view that cuts across Democrat and Republican of people thinking that Washington is too big, bloated federal government, waste, fraud, and abuse. I mean, those are drain the swamp is what people run on over and over again. How do they feel? What do they think they're actually cutting?
Yeah, what do they think they're actually cutting? Democrats want to argue that the type of spending that Musk is cutting is mainly necessary programs, but that comes in at just 36%. The wasteful spending actually wins the plurality here at 42%, according to a recent Washington Post Ipsos poll. And I think that is the reason why you see that when it comes to Musk and DOGE, you see, in fact, the majority believe he should have some influence because they believe, the plurality believe, that he is cutting wasteful spending, not necessary programs that Democrats are arguing.
Survey says a majority of people agree with Trump and Elon that DOGE is doing important work. Dusk and Moj. 54% want Elon to continue to influence public policy. 51% want the dynamic duo to cut government agency. Now look, it's true. 51% is not some massive supermajority in our polarized times. It's actually hard to get a supermajority for anything, frankly. Keep in mind, though, Trump's popular vote win, it was just about 50%. Actually, it was a smidge under at 49.8%, according to the latest numbers I could find. So the media's narrative is that these DOGE cuts are politically ruinous, that people who voted for Trump are horrified by what he's doing and they're ready to turn on him. But actually, the cuts enjoy slightly more support than Trump himself got in the election, which suggests to me the reverse is true. Even some people who didn't vote for Trump nevertheless do want the GOP and DOGE to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. So I think the mainstream media and the Democratic Party are frequently undercounting how popular the Trump agenda, including the cutting government part, actually is. Now, that's nothing new, of course. Media is constantly making it sound as if there's some large, critical mass of voters who oppose what the GOP stands for. I mean, look how they portrayed another storyline from last week when California Governor Gavin Newsom went on conservative podcaster Charlie Kirk's show and admitted he doesn't think trans women belong in women's sports. We discussed this on Rising last week. Niall and Stephen Kent did a fine job. Now, the local ABC outlet spun the story thus, quote, Governor Gavin Newsom is drawing heavy criticism after hosting a controversial and conservative activist on his new podcast and saying participation of transgender athletes in women's sports is deeply unfair. Heavy criticism? Really? From who? If they said he was drawing charges of hypocrisy or opportunism, I might agree with them. Criticism? Most people agree with that stance. Again, let the actual polls be the judge. According to the New York Times, 79% of Americans do not think trans women should compete in women's sports. It's 67% of Democrats. The polls don't lie. The mainstream media spent more time listening to the polls, which, to be fair, are in fact conducted expertly and correctly by mainstream media institutions in many cases, less time listening to the elite progressive commentators that they employ, well, the Democratic Party would be in a much healthier place. That's what the survey says.
So, Robby, you said at the start we will disagree or fight about this one. We will about the Elon Musk element of it. But to be fair, I actually agree with some of your overall point there. We have disagreements, particularly about COVID and various other topics. But, you know, I do have issues with the way the media has fractured, and I think it has in some ways lent itself to disinformation and misinformation and so forth. But I do think that previously, when legacy media was the media, it sometimes created the impression that certain things were more popular with the general public than they were because they were popular with the demographic that most mainstream journalists inhabit. And so immigration, I think, which you and I have odd sort of mix of opinions on. Right. I mean, I think that it was seen for too long as if, well, everyone just accepts a certain number of millions of unauthorized migrants in the country and so forth. And actually, that's not the case. The trans issue, which you pointed out in Newsom's case, I think it is part of that. So it is, I think, fine to call out media for creating a sort of false consensus on those issues when it didn't actually exist. On Elon Musk, there's a couple of things I would say where we do disagree there. One is almost every poll I have seen shows Musk himself less popular than Trump.
Musk himself, yes.
And so I do think that that's one of the reasons why he's a more inviting target for Democrats. Richest man in the world, trying to enact these very, very sweeping government reforms and government cuts. The bigger point I would make is I think that right now we're at the front end of this, where it has been borne aloft or along by the rhetoric, government's too big, there's wasteful government. And no one really disputes there is waste in government. What I am curious about is what happens when the rubber meets the road in terms of these cuts. Because there has been decades now of, I would say, anti-government rhetoric in this country. And it is government that sends out Social Security checks, does Medicare, funds the majority of Medicaid, does, you know, veterans affairs and healthcare and all of that. All of these things are popular, and if these cuts impede government's ability to deliver them, I think those poll numbers could change very fast.
Yes, those things are popular. I agree with that. And even the, you know, and I try to be willing to admit when I hold a policy position that is not itself popular. Right, I would privatize Social Security. I would cut Medicare. I would do all those things. I recognize that that is not politically popular, and the Republican Party probably shouldn't go along and do that. I mean, they have to calculate which of the things that they believe in doing, do they have enough political goodwill to ram through, even if they're not popular. That would be a case. Maybe they would think doing that is worth it. Abortion's another example where, well, maybe they think, well, why do we win if not to implement some policy we think is good, even if it's not popular? You're right about Elon personally. Elon is less popular than Trump for the simple reason that he's not not an entertainment personality with like an appealing. I mean, I'm a fan of his. I think what he's doing is good. I think his companies are very important. he is himself kind of weird in the way he just behaves and talks and portrays himself, and that is not, he's not as appealing. I mean, Trump, love him or hate him, has some kind of appeal that is charisma, entertainment, some power that is unusual, that frankly no one else on earth has, which is why. And
I
Elon
think that's a bit rosy, but I take the point that he has appeal.
There's something compelling about him. That you just want to watch him talk, even if you don't like him. People want to rage listen to him. You're
I don't even
grimacing.
particularly love
well,
to
that's how
rage
people
listen,
feel.
but listen, he has an appeal to his base. So
Elon Musk was not a political figure before, and now he is a political figure. And if you just become a political figure, your popularity is going to go down because we're so closely divided. You're right that if these cuts start being about fundamental government services, and maybe that's what will happen, there will be a hit to the popularity. But the media is, I think, getting ahead of itself and already saying, oh, the coalition is fracturing. There's already some massive backlash pointing to, if we're going to talk about Elon's car companies being targeted a little bit, which, maybe that's a sign of some kind of blowback against Musk. But I think the massive backlash against what Trump's doing is, maybe it'll happen, it's just not there yet.
The popular backlash isn't there yet, but I think that it is very valid to question the wisdom of these policies and how they will manifest themselves, whether it's the government cuts or the tariffs question, where people like the slogan, but once the slogan goes into effect, how does that work? I've always thought that Trump himself has much more in common with talk radio guys like Rush Limbaugh than he does with standard orthodox governing people. And so what happens when you put a kind of talk radio mentality atop government? We're about to find out.
We find out you get the most politically successful Republican in our lifetime, but
or
you get good governance.
Or you get somebody who crashes the economy and has all sorts of other baleful effects.
We'll see. Next up on Rising, we will discuss the fallout from pro-Palestinian protesting on college campuses across the country. The Trump administration promised that there would be a price to pay for what it considers anti-Semitic protests on college campuses. Now Columbia University is in the administration's crosshairs. The New York City Ivy League was ground zero for last spring's demonstrations and student encampments about what was happening in Gaza. President Donald Trump has promised to deport international students who participated in, quote, pro-jihadist protests on college campuses.
On Saturday night, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents stopped Mahmoud Khalil. He is a Palestinian graduate student who acted as a leader in negotiations between protesters and Columbia officials last spring. He was informed that his student visa had been revoked, according to the Washington Post, who received a statement from his lawyer. The catch, Khalil is in fact a green card holder, which means, of course, that he is a lawful permanent resident.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio posted on X, "We will be revoking the visas and or green cards of Hamas supporters in America so that they can be deported." The Anti-Defamation League's Jonathan Greenblatt was swift to applaud the move. He posted a long tweet on X that said, in part, "Over the past 18 months, these institutions have not effectively addressed the rot of anti-Semitism. That's why they scored so poorly on ADL's recent campus anti-Semitism report card. It's abominable to see how a minority of malevolent students, radicalized faculty, and outside agitators have hijacked the school, diverting it away from its core purpose, preventing everyone else from studying, learning, and working."
Reactions in support of the protesters were swift. Journalist Peter Beinart wrote on X, "Anyone with eyes can see that the Trump administration is using claims of anti-Semitism to cripple universities, along with independent media, because they are centres of resistance to its effort at authoritarian rule. And the ADL is applauding. It's applauding an assault on liberal democracy itself. What a shameful moment in American Jewish history." The level of clampdown against Americans is unlike any other since 9/11. That too was a period when Arabs living in the US could be routinely swept up and placed in jail without due process.
The move comes on the heels of the administration pulling $400 million that had been earmarked for the university. According to the administration officials, at least 9 other universities, including USC and UCLA, are also being investigated for anti-Semitic behavior. So I am not in support of this as a general principle. I am an ardent defender of free speech and the First Amendment. Now, of course, it is probably probably would to be argued and beyond the scope of my legal expertise for whether the First Amendment applies to, I think it certainly applies to green card holders, but to people on student visas, it may, I don't know, I'm not making a claim either way. It might be constitutional for the government to revoke their status. I would think that would not be the case for green card holders, but perhaps for student visas based on whatever reason, frankly. That may not violate the First Amendment. You could make an argument, certainly, that it does. I could understand the argument. I've said this before. The First Amendment is a restraint on the government's behavior. It's not actually just affirmative right. I mean, if you think about what it says the federal government may not infringe on free speech.
Sure.
Now, for instance, in the example of the TikTok case, they said, well, that's a Chinese foreign company, so the First Amendment does not apply. That's what the Supreme Court said. I could see a similar argument here for students who are not, although you could still make the case, while they're here, they benefit, if they're actually in the country, they benefit from the protections of the First Amendment. Either way, I don't think it's a good look. I don't think it's a good idea to be cracking down on dissent. I have no sympathy for, no common cause for the minority of the protesters who are, in my view, displaying outright solidarity with or sympathy for Hamas. We can argue about how much of the movement that is. I've repeatedly referenced one of the pro-Palestinian student groups that put out a statement in support of what Hamas did on the day of the terrorist attack. I think that is loathsome and deserves criticism, but I am very, very reluctant, inclined not to ever endorse an effort by the federal government to violate people's free speech rights, even if I find the speech reprehensible, because the government is not a good determinator of what speech is beyond the pale, and this same power will be used against my speech or your speech or hate speech or misinformation. It's the slippery slope. We see it in practice all the time. I would not do this.
There are several messy elements to this case in particular, and then I'll talk more about the bigger picture of it. But in this case, to your point about student visas versus green cards, the agents who came to detain this guy, Mahmoud Khalil, appear to have believed wrongly that he was still on a student visa, when in fact he is, according to his lawyer, a green card holder. And as you correctly point out, having a green card does not give you absolutely every right of a citizen, but does give you much more protection than if you're simply on a student visa. There is then a separate question that no one appears to know where this guy is now. He was initially processed in downtown Manhattan. Now there's some suggestion he could be held as far away as Louisiana, and his lawyer has not been told where he is. I think that obviously is really serious cause for concern. The bigger picture here is that in a way, I think when obviously it is important, his case is important on a human level. I don't know exactly what the allegations are against him. He says they're to do with social media posts that he didn't write. I think that there are genuine questions about people on student visas who articulate views that are blatantly pro any kind of terrorist organization or pro-violence. That is different from the widespread expression of sympathy for the Palestinian cause. So I have a lot of problems with the idea of a creeping authoritarianism or abridgment of those views.
Yeah, I really want to know more about what they're saying that he did right. Again, even frankly, from my point of view, even if I would be most sympathetic to some kind of, you could revoke his visa if he was engaged in a kind of, if he was one of the people occupying the building. They said he was doing negotiation on behalf of that group. Like, well, if he now occupying the building is not the most serious of what, like, trespassing violations. Yeah. You know, if there are students here on visas engaged in rioting or violence or something, well, yeah, that's not free speech. You could make the argument for revoking their visas. Right. I don't know exactly what he was doing.
Well, and Dropsite News, which is a fairly new news organization, did get a statement from a DHS spokesperson. And this is what I mean about the creeping sort of authoritarianism. The spokesperson said, Khalid led activities aligned to Hamas. What does that even mean? I mean, if you're calling for an end to Israel's assault on Gaza, are you doing that? Or does it need to be more than that? Are you saying victory to Hamas? I mean,
am I engaged in activities aligned with Russia because I agree that Ukraine should seek peace immediately? Right. It starts to become that level of just agreeing with some adversary or just recognizing the reality of the situation is, and I'm very cautious about people should have the right to criticize Israel. It is not the same thing as just criticizing Jewish people. I think a lot of the people engaged in these protests are not going about it in the smartest way, and I have seen displays of outright support for Hamas that I think is abominable, but again, it's free. It's a free country.
And to the point about it being a free country, just on the bigger picture, the thing that I think is, with all due respect to Mr. Khalil, the broader, more worrying thing is this revocation of a massive amount of funding for Columbia that seems designed to have Columbia punish its students for expressing views that the administration doesn't agree with in some way. And you see that as being part of this bigger picture where the Trump administration has attacked the judiciary in terms of calling for the impeachment of judges, attacked law enforcement in terms of booting out people who it considers associated with the January the 6th cases and inserting loyalists in their place, attacked the media by suing CBS, and there is just this kicking away of the pillars of dissent or pluralism in a democratic society.
Here's where we might disagree. I don't necessarily disagree with what you're just saying, and I think a lot of the Trump administrations you just listed are not, I don't agree with them. I don't agree with suing CBS or any of those cases. I would not specifically yank the funding from Columbia because it's the kind of activism its students are engaged in.
Right.
I would, however, be in favor of giving less government funding to elite, powerful, wealthy, private educational institutions. Do they need government money? Do they need the taxpayers to subsidize Columbia University, among the most prestigious and elite institutions in the world?
That's a separate institution.
Well, I don't know.
It's a separate argument because you basically, as a libertarian, believe in government spending and almost nothing.
Well, I would rather do government spending on just about anything else than Columbia University. Does a swimming pool need do we need a new tennis court? Do we need a flat screen TV in every dorm room? My goodness.
But you wouldn't, as a free speech activist,
they should not be
propose the money being taken away because of views that their students
exhibit. I would just
exhibit.
take it away not for that reason, just because they don't have a right to our money and are not.
But I know we're having a lot, but it has to concern. I mean, yes.
No, it does concern me. I mean, what can I say? It does concern me. Yes.
Okay.
They should not be punished for that reason.
Right.
I would say that, universities being investigated for the wrong think or behaviors of the students is nothing new and is not just something the Trump administration suddenly did. I complained for years and did a lot of reporting on similar threats to revoke federal funding for educational institutions based on them, the Obama and Biden administration's conviction that they were not taking Title IX seriously enough, that they were allowing too much sexual harassment and misconduct on campus, that I thought those actions were threatening free speech because they started prescribing, well, if there's an accusation, then these are the procedures you need to go through, and the procedures are just, even from a progressive standpoint, are so unfriendly to due process and basic fairness, and that was being forced on them by the federal government with the threat of federal funding being revoked. If we just didn't give the federal funding, that threat would not exist anymore.
Well, we need to keep institutions at their finest, most well-researched, resourced element.
Okay. Up next, did two millennial lawmakers from opposite sides of the aisle find a secret sauce to be able to work together? That's AOC and Anna Paulina Luna. We'll discuss. Stay tuned. Even in the realm of politics, the idea of opposites attract can still apply. Congresswomen Anna Paulina Luna and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a very conservative Republican and a very left-leaning Democrat, have come together on new legislation.
On Friday, they introduced a bill that would cap credit card interest rates at 10%.
Now, Luna wrote on X, for too long, credit card companies have abused working-class Americans with absurd interest rates, trapping them in an almost insurmountable amount of debt. We need a fair solution. That means getting rid of the status quo and putting a reasonable cap on interest rates.
Ocasio-Cortez also commented on the legislation, writing in a press release, credit cards with high interest rates regularly trap working people in endless cycles of debt. At a time when families are struggling to make ends meet, we cannot allow big banks to shake down our communities for profit. During his campaign, President Trump pledged to cap credit card interest rates at 10%. we're making that pledge more than a talking point by introducing legislation to protect working people from remaining trapped under mountains of debt.
Right now, the average credit card interest rate is a little under 29%, according to Forbes. Now, according to the Fed, the lowest credit card interest rate ever was about 11.88% during the 2008 recession.
And last month, Senators Josh Hawley and Bernie Sanders, another very conservative Republican and very left-wing, not even officially a Democrat, independent, introduced a very similar bill.
And President Trump seems to be on board with the idea. During a rally in September, he told a crowd, while working Americans catch up, we're going to put a temporary cap on credit card interest rates. We're going to cap it at around 10%. We can't let them make 25 and 30%. Some aren't too thrilled with this, however. Northwestern University economist C. Carabo Jackson warned on X, such a policy, though well-meaning, will almost certainly lead to credit rationing, whereby low-income borrowers get no credit at all. A cap at 30% could be beneficial, but 10 is way too low. To be clear, this is not just a hot take. Research does indicate this. And Eddie Scarry of The Federalist suggested it would make more sense to make credit interest rates of a certain percentage only legally obtainable by individuals at or above a certain credit score. So this, I know what this is going to be. This is going to be a case of you agreeing with the right and left coming together and me being no fun and being against this.
Exactly. You're going to be the staunch defender of credit card companies and their huge profits, Robby.
Well, I mean, again, it's just reality because, as that economist said, what's going to happen is they're just not going to offer credit cards at that level. If you, like, you can't get around economic reality. If the government says you're not allowed to make this kind of transaction, again, which is violating human consent, no one is forcing people to take a credit card out at that interest rate. Companies saying, here's a credit card and here's what the interest rate is going to be. Do you accept? And you're saying, yes, I accept. So, brother, that's on you. I don't know what the government should have to do with this. It's a consent. It's I consent, and the government says, but I don't.
Yep.
Give me 30 more seconds and you can chime in. So I think what's going to happen is, as that economist says, they're just not going to offer credit cards to high-risk people at all. I mean, the reason the interest rate is higher is for people who are a riskier investment or a riskier borrower. That's for the company to still have economic incentive to do it. They make the interest rate that. If you take away that protection on the credit card company side, they're just not going to offer it to people whose credit scores are shaky, and that will be bad for working people.
So I think what is bad for working people is extortionate rates of loans of whatever kind, whether that's credit cards, payday loans, or anything else. And this argument that the credit card companies are going to be so put upon by these kind of regulations seems to me to fly in the face of what kind of profits they generate. We noted in the introduction about Bernie Sanders and Josh Hawley coming together, and Sanders, being Sanders, of course, helpfully provided some information on that. In the past 5 years, Visa's profits were $67.5 billion. MasterCard's $44 billion, American Express $33 billion. So it's not as if these companies are like struggling in some way that their entire being would be called into question if they lowered the interest rate. Now you can, I agree, have an argument about what the interest rate should be. I'm also kind of struck by the shock of me agreeing with Eddie Scarry in something, because why do we have this idea that credit has to be extended to everyone, and therefore, because we take that as the starting point, it's okay to have extortionate rates? There are people who don't have the means to avail of credit and are going to get themselves deeper into the hole when they're paying 27 or 30 or 40%. And it is fine to say, well, you don't qualify.
But no one makes you do that. I mean, again, you say extortionate, but it's just an arrangement between two private parties that I'm going to loan you this money and you're going to pay it back at this rate, and that's just should not be the government's business. That's just a transaction. Just as if I say I'm going to pay the neighbor kid to mow my lawn, and I'm willing to give them $20, and they say okay, and they're willing to do that, and the government says no, you got to give them $30. Then I say, okay, never mind, I'll just do it myself. But like, that's what happens.
The problem is that it is a way of taking advantage of people who, for whatever reason, feel that they require liquidity that they don't possess. And then they are left with paying an average of 27% when the actual Fed rate of interest is about 4.5%. So that, I mean, the basic business model of the credit card industry is we will push credit to people and we will actually hope that a significant number of them can't afford to repay that on time because we make money through the interest and the fees.
Yes.
And so that is, in of its very nature, something that is at the least susceptible to manipulative behavior or digging people deeper and
Nobody's
deeper
being
into
tricked.
debt. And it
They
is
know
a
exactly-
perfectly acceptable practice of the government to say we have to cap that at a certain level because at a certain point it just becomes willfully taking advantage of people.
Okay, but what if I'm a person who has fallen on economic hard times, but I can get myself back on my feet, but I need this credit card in a form of a loan, essentially thing, to get to that place, and I'm willing to pay an exorbitantly high fee because I need it right now, and I'm going to get myself back on my feet when I do that, and I'm willing, I know, yeah, I got to pay whatever, 20, 30%, I know that, I'm willing to do that, and you're the lender, you're willing to do it. Again, it just comes down to a fundamental philosophical difference I guess we have. I think that should be a legal transaction between those two people, and you're saying the government should step in and say, no, you're being manipulated, you should not have access to this.
Yeah, I'm saying that at a certain point it becomes excessive and that the government has a valid interest in curbing excessively extortionate behavior on the part of financial institutions. If someone was in the scenario that you're talking about, they could go to a bank that charges significantly lower interest rates and try to provide liquidity to themselves in that fashion.
Well,
the problem, I mean, there is...
Aren't those, I'm no expert on this in general, but isn't it notoriously difficult to get loans for people with bad credit or bad financial circumstances to get these kinds of arrangements from banks for precisely that reason?
But this goes to actually my broader sort of cultural point, which, to be fair, isn't really ideological, which is that we have got so accustomed in this country in particular to people racking up enormous amounts of debt. And not to sound completely old school here, but like people should live more frugally and not carry on average vast sums of debt. And the reason that is difficult for so many people is because there are so many people in very, very low income jobs. And the disparity between a very small, for example, federal minimum wage and living expenses is so great that it pitches people into these kind of debt traps.
Well, I agree that you should not get yourself into heavy amounts of debt. I mean, I warn this. We probably have very different attitudes about how to solve the student loan debt crisis, but I advise people that do not go significantly into the debt for an elite college education. If you're wealthy and you're spending your parents' money and you really want to do that, fine. But do not think that going $50 or $100 or more $1,000 into debt for a degree from a fancy college is going to necessarily be worth it. Obviously, depends what you study. If you take out that money to be a doctor or maybe a lawyer, although even a lot of lawyers can't get jobs, really think through it.
Right.
Just to get a very fancy, expensive liberal arts degree, you are destroying yourself. You can get the same quality, similar-ish quality education affordably from a much cheaper school, and that will be worth it in the vast majority of cases. And that is my general advice to people.
You see, we have a moment of agreement after all.
All right, coming up, is Elon Musk's involvement in politics hurting his company, leading to violence and destruction against Tesla? We'll talk. Stay with us. Well, it is safe to say that some people are not too happy with tech titan Elon Musk.
So much so that there have been a swarm of protests recently against Musk and his electric car company, Tesla.
Some people have even, for instance, earlier this year, Colorado police arrested a 42-year-old woman for allegedly causing between $5,000 and $20,000 in damage at a Tesla dealership. Police say that she ignited Molotov cocktails in the parking lot and then spray-painted Nazi on the entrance sign. Earlier this month, Massachusetts police said that 7 Tesla charging stations were set on fire. Also this month, Oregon police said that 3 cars were damaged, windows were shattered, after someone fired at least 7 shots at a Tesla dealership. More recently, on March 8th, there were more than 350 protesters at a Tesla showroom in New York City. Police did arrest 6 people.
There's even uproar in places overseas. In Berlin this month, for instance, there were several fires at a Tesla factory construction site. Police are investigating whether that was arson. Prosecutors in France said that a dozen Tesla cars were set ablaze and that this was, quote, not at all accidental.
According to reports, Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim is appearing to cut ties with Musk's Starlink. Slim's America Mobile announced a $22 billion investment in their telecommunications network, signaling a shift away from Musk's company.
In late February, Musk's net worth had declined by more than $100 billion. Poor Elon. This coincided with an increase in sell-offs of Tesla shares. In Europe, Tesla sales dropped 45%, even though electric vehicle sales overall rose 37%. That's according to Bloomberg.
So far, Musk's DOGE has cut more than 62,000 federal jobs, which angered many on the left. Of course, DOGE plans to make even more cuts. The Department of Veterans Affairs, for instance, plans to cut thousands of jobs very, very soon.
In January, many accused Musk of throwing up what they called a Nazi salute. The ADL, an organization that combats anti-Semitism, defended Musk and argued that the salute was essentially meaningless.
Musk took to X yesterday amid all this upheaval, writing, "Heartfelt thanks to everyone supporting Tesla, despite the many attacks against our stores and offices."
So, are Musk's political ventures worth all of this trouble? Or is this just a brief bump in the road?
Well, I think he probably clearly feels it's worth it. He has made a series of savvy bets in order to have a lot of political power for various reasons. We can debate whether his motives are good or bad, or some mix therein. I would say the violence against Tesla company, the smashing of windows, these things, these are certainly bad, deplorable. I condemn them. I presume you do as well. I don't know. I'm always a little cautious when kinds of things happen. Like, is this even a pattern? I'm sure something like there's protesters. Sure, that's about this. Are other crazy people just like, setting things on fire?
Bandwagon effect.
There's some amount of that happening anyway, and there's a kind of contagion effect where, like, when someone becomes more notable, then that becomes the reason crazy people act out. But it's not really. Mentally ill people are actually frequently finding some kind of crazy political motivation for the things that they do.
Well, that is true, but at the same time, there are obviously organized protests that we showed some of there, where the whole point is to be countering him, to be showing dissent against him. I think that people standing outside Tesla dealerships protesting and holding signs about how they think Elon Musk is terrible is completely fine.
Of course.
I think that people setting fire to cars or vandalizing premises or whatever is not fine, and to be clear, I share your disagreement with that. On the point of Elon Musk making a savvy bet, I think that he has bought political influence, certainly, and I've said that many times. Spent more than $250 million getting Donald Trump elected. He is now harvesting, in my view, in a very damaging way, the dividend from that by being able to have such a central role in government. The other thing, just in passing, is that lots of people, including me, when he first bought what was then Twitter, thought that's a kind of bad investment, and in fact, I was misunderstanding what he was really trying to do.
Yes.
As a
Yes.
business decision in isolation, it was I think, a bad decision, but I don't think that was his motivation. I think his motivation was buying a megaphone for the kind of views that he believes in, much as a press baron of old might have bought a newspaper for that purpose. I think it has made X measurably worse, and I dislike it a lot more, but it has been an effective move on his part.
Yeah, Jeff Bezos has been looking at the Washington Post, which he owns, and thinking, why has this not served to broadcast my views the way X has for Elon Musk, which is why he put out that memo last week trying to bring the opinion pages, at least, more in line with what he thinks is good policy. As you point out, yes, Elon owning the platform allowed him to, he's its most celebrated user, to broadcast his views, to align the platform more with conservative messaging, and was just perhaps just as important or similarly important to getting the Trump message out there as his donations to Trump's political cause. I think Elon, his fortunes are so vast they can go up or down by $100 billion. His bet is that a Trump presidency will be good on the regulatory front for all sorts of his companies, Tesla, also SpaceX. That our future is going to be so guided by the importance and the paramount importance of tech policy. Now, I'm broadly in favor of this. I don't think Elon should be able to craft government policy in a way that is uniquely favorable to his specific firms. That I'm against, or favorable treatment for his contract as a contractor. That I am concerned about. But I do want the regulation. For instance, there was a Biden executive order on AI that I thought was overly restrictive of the technology. China is coming out with new AI. It's very important for me as a foreign policy goal, a national security goal, for us to be out innovating our main geopolitical rival. And I think Trump and Bezos and the other tech titans feel that way too, and are getting on board with Trump largely for that reason, because they think a Trump administration, a Republican administration more broadly, is going to unleash their potential to dominate, for America to dominate these industries.
So 2 points on that. One about, things that benefit Elon's personal interests versus a general policy. I think it is often hard to distinguish those things. The problem that I have is that one can so easily bleed into the other. So, for example, DOGE has spearheaded the effective hollowing out of the CFPB. You and I have different views on the utility of the CFPB, but one of its functions would have been, for example, to regulate a mobile payment system that X is apparently planning to launch. So by hollowing that out, Elon removes a force of regulation over his own business interests. Just briefly circling back to where we began on the Tesla point, it's interesting to me, and you might even agree with this, how the same thing can become differently politically coded within a very short space of time. Because, of course, one of the reasons that Tesla sales are falling, particularly in Europe, is that at one point, buying the Tesla was the liberal concerned about the environment, concerned about carbon emissions. We're going to run a more green kind of approach to transportation, with an Elon Musk who was then purportedly Democrat or Democrat-leaning or whatever.
Right.
And now he's this ultra-Trumpy ex-person who supports the AfD in Germany, and so the sales have gone completely the opposite way.
I mean, this demonstrates the difficulty of separating. I mean, I agree with you. It's difficult to separate his financial interests and the politics, but in fairness, I don't think a lot of people in progressive or Democratic circles are sitting around complaining about the influence, if you go back, of some, go green energy titan like Elon Musk saying, yeah, let's have more, funding for let's build more charging stations, let's promote EVs. I mean, Democrats were promoting EVs. That was their message during a couple of years ago, during some of the price shortage, cars becoming much more expensive. They were saying yeah, go get a Tesla, it's a great investment, or go get an electric vehicle. And if Elon was all for that then, is that the nefarious influence?
Right.
Now, when he's on the other side saying, actually, don't invest in these things, my technology can compete, but that is improper, it becomes hard to, businessmen just have to shut up, say nothing about the circumstance its improper influence.
Well, look, honestly, that's a valid point, and I have said, including on this show numerous times, the thing that I have an issue with is the influence of extremely wealthy people or corporations on our politics. That does not only support one party. I think it pulls the Democratic Party often in a more corporate-friendly direction than I would like, but that's a whole other day's work. But look, there's too much money in politics, and I think there should be much stricter limits on it. I think government should bring down its fist, Robby, and prevent people giving these millions and millions of dollars to their political choices.
Up next, a nation in the Middle East stands on the brink. That nation is Syria. We will discuss the violence there coming up next. Well, who could have predicted this? A former member of the ISIS terrorist group is leading the charge to ostensibly bring peace to the nation of Syria. But not so fast. Syria is now seeing the worst outbreak of violence since the ousting of former President Bashar al-Assad late last year. Assad is currently in exile in Russia.
The current people in charge said the violence was necessary in order to thwart an insurgency by the former dictator's loyalists. The Syrian Network for Human Rights said that at least 642 people have died in the recent violence, including scores of civilians who were killed after government forces committed, quote, widespread field executions of young men and other adults. So in this new era of President Trump's America First, why should we care about Syria? Here to unpack this all is renowned Syria expert Joshua Landis, who heads up the Middle Eastern Studies Department at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome to Rising, Joshua.
It's a pleasure. Pleasure to be with you both.
Absolutely. So I think, firstly, the main question that a lot of people have who are just looking at this recent outspread of violence is very simple. What's going on? What is actually happening here?
Well, there has been widespread massacre on the coast of Syria. Now, to put it in some context, the coast of Syria is where most of Syria's Alawites live. There's a mountain range that goes up and down from north to south in Syria, and it is heavily populated by Alawites. This is the group, the religious sect and community that Bashar al-Assad and the Assad family, who ruled Syria for 50 years, came from this region. And the new government in Syria, led by Ahmed Shara, is made up of people who were loyal to al-Qaeda and worked with al-Qaeda, now called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And they sent there was a call to send troops to the coast, and all sorts of militias. Syria does not have a unified government rule today. There are many different militias, some of whom have said that they're loyal and put themselves under the control of the new government that's only been in power for 3 months. But others retain a great deal of autonomy and independence. They all organized and began to come to the coast 3 nights ago on this general call for mobilization, and began going through the various cities on the coast, Latakia, Tartus, Benias, Jebli. And it became a paroxysm of violence, and people's homes were attacked, and many people were shot in their houses, whole families, and their cars were stolen, their property stolen, any jewelry they had. 3 of my wife's cousins had their houses attacked, 2 in Benias, 1 in Jebli. And men, they were just lucky to get away with their lives, because men asked them first thing in the door. They knock on the door, they say, open up. And if you don't open up, then they ask you, are you an Alawite? And because these cities are mixed with Sunnis, Alawites, and some Christians. And then they ask you if you're Alawite, and they proceeded to ask for their car keys and steal everything. They went through the Alawite sections of town with local informers to help guide them on whose houses are Alawite and who lives where, and stripped the place. My brother-in-law was up in the village, the paternal village, in the mountains, and only yesterday did these militias get up to the villages, and everybody in the village, about 100 people, hid by the river behind rocks and trees for the entire day, because militias came to the village and began just shooting up the houses. They found 2 men who they told to come out, and they approached them and shot them both in the head. And but the villagers hid by the stream for the entire day, and the troops then left the village after stealing everything and went on to the next villages. And there's word, it's hard to get really good information out. I spoke to my brother-in-law, but nobody's moving. Everybody's so terrified they're trying to hide, and they don't really know what's going on. They're calling each other, and that's the best information that people can get. But those troops are still in the region, and Ahmed Shara, the president, has called for order and said that militias should stop doing this. but they haven't stopped, at least not in the mountainside. There are some UN observers that have gone to Jeble on the coast. So things are being tamped down by the government. This has clearly got way, way out of hand. We believe that the numbers of dead now are well over 1,000, and new photos, horrifying photos of stacks of dead people being buried in mass graves are coming out all the time.
Yes, deeply, deeply horrifying. I mean, what you're describing is just a kind of looting and pillaging from the medieval era. A conquering army comes in and starts massacring people and taking their things indiscriminately. Obviously, the Assad regime was guilty of all sorts of atrocities. There's no defense of Assad whatsoever. But does this complicate, American foreign policy and the kind of, I would say, hopefulness or a rosy picture that was painted by some foreign policy experts about the fall of Assad being a good thing for human rights and such, because he was certainly a brutal dictator. But what we've seen in so many other contexts in the Middle East is that an ouster of a brutal dictator does not necessarily mean the proliferation of a liberal humanitarian ethos overtaking the country. In fact, we've seen the emboldening of terrorism or violence or religious totalitarianism is what can come in the wake of the ouster of a dictator. So what does this mean for our hopes for Syria from a Western democratic standpoint?
Right. Well, Syria is very far from democracy, and Ahmed Shara, the new ruler of Syria, who used to lead, who was a partner of Caliph Baghdadi and ISIS, broke away from him and started his own faction, and actually got into a war with ISIS, but ended up building up a statelet in Idlib, north of Syria, near the Turkish border, heavily supported by Turkey and to a certain degree, by other Western foreign governments that were sharing intelligence with him, it seems. And he's come to power. He's quite a chameleon. He can show a different face to different crowds and tell them what they want to hear. He's trying to ride a tiger because there are many different militias that he does not control. And there are big hunks of the country that are not under his control. The Kurdish region in the northeast, where America has a no-fly zone and is supporting a Kurdish-led military, the Syrian Democratic Forces. In the south, there are the Druze, 3% of Syrians, a minority, that Israel has said that they're going to protect and said that the government cannot send troops south of Damascus. So that area is largely uncontrolled by the government. And now the coastal region, where many of the Alawites live. And there are a lot of tough guys. And this battle began with the regime attacking some drug dealers in this very poor section of Latakia. They came in, there was killings there, and these drug dealers, and the regime sent in pickup trucks with heavy machine guns on the back, and they just began to shoot up the entire neighborhood, calling people pigs and Alawites and saying that they were going to kill them. So it started this very sectarian type of retribution. And then there was another fight by what's called a shabiha, this sort of thuggish guy who had been operating in the mountains, shot up about 10 regime soldiers. And at that point, Ahmed Shara calls for general mobilization and everybody to go to the coast. And this turned into massive, it just escalated way out of control.
We just have a couple of minutes left, Joshua, but one thing that I'm curious about is this going to extend beyond an attack on the Alawite minority, who were perceived certainly as the bedrock of Assad's support, to a more broader sectarianism? And more generally, whether it does or doesn't do that, do you anticipate that we're in, regrettably, some sort of escalatory spiral where this is going to get worse quickly?
Well, it's very hard to tell. The government is going to try to get control of this because this has damaged Ahmed Shara tremendously in the international community. Both the White House in the United States has spoken out against him and said that the State Department, Rubio, has said that America stands on the side of Syria's minorities, Alawites, Christians, Kurds, Druze, which is bad news for Ahmed Shara and his new government, because America has crushing sanctions on the country. Shara has been pleading with the Americans in the West to lift those sanctions. Very unlikely that the United States is going to lift sanctions. Israel has spoken out against this as well and is taking very tough line against Syria and the new government. And so this is going to be very difficult. Europe has taken a sort of medium line on this and is showing some separation from the United States today on Syria. Normally it speaks with one voice with the United States, but because of the contretemps between Europe and the United States, this is now diverging. And it's going to make it extremely hard for this new government to dig out from this. Whether the sectarian violence will continue, it's still continuing today. I've talked to relatives this morning, and they're still all hiding in their houses. And there's new reports of dead people. How much this is going to extend beyond today, I think the government is furiously trying to tamp this down because it realizes that the implications are just terrible for the future of Syria.
Well, we certainly hope for the safety of your family and an immediate end to this really appalling violence. Thank you so much for coming on the program to detail some of this. This was very informative and helpful. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
One leading Democrat says that her party has not yet come to terms with their problems. We'll discuss. Stay tuned. Some Democrats are finally admitting that there are problems within the party leadership and its strategy. Michigan Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin appeared on Meet the Press this past weekend. Here's what she had to say.
Look, I mean, people know me. I'm pretty straightforward. I don't think it's a secret that Democrats have been on their heels since Trump won the election, right? I don't think that's something hidden. And I think it's on us to be clear about not only leadership, and there's lots of leaders in both parties, but also a strategy, right? And I think that's something that as Trump has been successful in flooding the zone and just like every day 15 things happening, we are still finding our footing. And I think you can't get better until you admit you have a problem. And for me, that's one of the things that I think some of the new voices in the party have really been agitating about, right? New senators, new representatives, new folks who are like, hey, we need to do more, and we need to be showing that we're actually having a plan to stand up on really important moments of inflection. So that's what I'm trying to do from within.
Minority Leader Representative Hakeem Jeffries had a very different tone last week in response to President Trump's joint address to Congress. Here's what he said.
We have the Republicans on the run on three core issues. They are on the run in terms of the economy. We have a plan, and we understand that we need to execute it with the fierce urgency of now.
Veteran Democratic strategist James Carville wrote an op-ed last month in the New York Times, and he said, with no clear leader to voice our opposition and no control in any branch of government, it's time for Democrats to embark on the most daring political manoeuvre in the history of our party. Roll over and play dead. Allow the Republicans to crumble beneath their own weight and make the American people miss us.
I mean, that's kind of just what's going to happen by default, since the Democrats don't have a very appealing, they don't really have a messenger, I think they don't have a message or a messenger. They don't have someone whose star power can just match Trump's ability to command the news cycle. They don't have an appealing enough figure. Their leadership are people like Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, who are just not interesting and charismatic individuals themselves. That's going to be a problem separate from then the substance of what they're running on and how they're opposing Trump, which they just haven't found a clear strategy for yet either. Now, I think that I'm against the tariffs. Now, the tariffs are actually not going into effect because they issued exceptions for like 98% of the things that are covered by the tariffs, which I think is a good idea. So maybe there won't be any economic ruin. I think if you actually did massive tariffs on Canada and Mexico, you would tank the economy, and that would be good for the fortunes of Democrats. So maybe just let roll over and play dead and let Republicans do that. If that's what actually happens, then there would be something for Democrats to campaign on, but they're not going into effect, it seems. Other than that, I don't know what they really do have a winning hand on.
So here's what I think is really interesting. In the middle of all this Democratic fretting and infighting to a degree.
Disarray.
And
use our favorite
Dems
alliteration.
Dems in disarray.
Dying Dems, despair of the destroyed disarray they find themselves in.
That is an impressive amount of alliteration, but I'm glad that you said it, not me. Let me put it that way. The person who is drawing most excitement now, which you may or may not have seen, is Bernie Sanders, who is on this tour against the oligarchy. I wish I could do the Bernie accent to pronounce oligarchy in the way that he does.
Billionaires. The billionaires and the oligarchs.
But
that was okay.
That was pretty
I give
good.
myself a 6 out of 10.
He's drawing thousands of people to these rallies in like Michigan and Wisconsin and places like that to hear that message. Now, Bernie Sanders is, I think, 82. He's certainly in his early 80s. He's, I think, very, very, very unlikely to be a candidate 4 years from now. But that message plainly is resonating. And if you compare that to, say, Hakeem Jeffries, who I think has been a real disappointment in the role that he's in, saying we have the Republicans on the run. Like, they obviously don't have the Republicans on the
laughable.
run. People who sit on my side of this table would prefer them to have Republicans on the run, but that...
They have the Republicans running away with everything.
That just obviously is not happening. So, and the kind of very mild opposition that has been put forth hasn't really worked. Now, one of the things that frustrates me whenever I see someone like Elissa Slotkin is there is this propensity to say, well, we need to come together with a message. Okay, what is it?
Right.
Like it's so
Very
easy
much so.
to just say, well, we need a strategy. Okay, what is your strategy? What is your message? Now, for what it's worth, not that the Democratic Party takes my advice, I think a greater level of economic populism, connecting with people's anger about economic stagnation and so forth, and less of what we might term identitarian politics would be a much better combination. But, I mean, that's up to the Democratic Party to decide. You need to decide something. That's the point.
I wonder how much hostility there is to actually doing that. I think there's hostility to adopting the kind of economic populism that Bernie Sanders represents, certainly. I don't know if there's as much hostility to letting go of identity politics now. Certainly there's some, because it's hard to do so, and there's, like the way the media spins things when Gavin Newsom says, well, yeah, we shouldn't have transgender women in women's sports, and then the media says, oh, very divisive, hateful remarks that drew widespread condemnation from one activist organization we consult on this issue. So that's still a problem for the Democratic Party, even if I think most Democrats realize that is a losing hand to keep harping on that kind of stuff. If Bernie Sanders had another run in him, I think the party would probably be in healthier shape, because you're right that he can still draw a crowd. And that has as much to do, in my view, with the message he runs on and the personality that he has, that he's an authentic, effective messenger of these ideas. And that is a problem, that even if they run on those ideas, if they don't have someone who can tap into a working class ethos, a resentment against elites from a Democratic perspective, they're just not going to be successful. And I don't know who else they can find to do that. There's AOC, etc. She is good at what she does in many ways. She has chosen to be a little bit more establishment friendly, I think. That's right. That's the left reading of her. There's criticism of her for that. So I think that's caused her some sincerity issues. But they got to find someone Bernie caliber to represent, to revive this movement, or it's just not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think AOC is a very charismatic figure, and I think she has some potential, but I also think in some way she's easier to cast as a kind of, I mean, even though she's not at all a coastal elite, former bartender and all that, she's easier to characterize than Bernie is as representing that kind of view. One final point that I'll make, just to be slightly more optimistic about the Democratic line, I do think that there's a chance that Trump just misfires with stuff like the tariffs and the cuts to government, and causes real economic pain, which could change the political picture very fast.
Right, it's what's it called, thermostatic public opinion, where there's immediate backlash to whoever is in power. I mean, we are now in a situation where it is the more common experience to have the ruling party tossed out. There used to be such a thing as incumbency advantage, right? Going back to the aughts and before that, where the person is generally reelected, their party generally does, in terms of the presidency at least. Congress was going back more and more. Now incumbency seems to be something of a disadvantage, frankly. So Democrats will be back, and you know, they lost. It was close. They'll be back in this, but they haven't really figured out how to maximize their odds.
I agree.
Up next, is the California dream no more? We have Susan Crabtree on her new book, Fool's Gold, about California's fate. Stay tuned. The California dream is as good as dead, according to journalist and author Susan Crabtree. In the forthcoming book, Fool's Gold, the radicals, con artists, and traitors who killed the California dream and now threaten us all, Crabtree points to the mounting crises that have plagued the Golden State for years, from devastating wildfires, skyrocketing homelessness, ever-increasing drug-related deaths, to smash-and-grab theft. This all happened on Democrats' watch. She writes, quote, "People don't know is what's driving these failures, why California's leaders have allowed them to spiral, and how this contagion could spread to every other city and town in the United States if it isn't exposed for what it is, failed far-left social experimentation." With us now is Susan Crabtree. She and journalist Jed McFadder co-authored this book, Fool's Gold, being released tomorrow. Welcome, Susan.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So it sounds like you really let the Democratic Party have it for its failed governance in the Golden State. Tell us more about the thesis of your book.
Well, the whole thesis is basically that California has become a dystopia, and the middle class California dream is no longer. It is now a fool's errand to pursue that dream unless you are a moneyed elite, just like Gavin Newsom and Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris. They all have so many ties. And we also go into each other, and we also go into the CCP, the Newsoms selling out California to the Chinese communist government, and how all of the gory details of how that played out.
So what would you point to as the largest crisis California is facing right now? Is it the high cost of buying homes? Is it actually the drug-related crime issues? What is the main thing chasing people who are leaving California? Why are they leaving?
We have the highest costs of almost everything, from utilities to gas to housing, everything, and we're not getting the benefits of safety. And I really believe that the crime issue is one of the biggest things that are driving people away. And from our book, we point out, we uncover the fact that Gavin Newsom, during the COVID pandemic, he released 70,000 prisoners, some of them violent, back onto the streets. His excuse was because they were safer. There was going to be a COVID epidemic in the prisons, but they were safer out in the communities. We found out that was a complete fabrication. That the COVID rates were higher in the communities than they were in the prisons. We talked to whistleblowers about this. So yes, again, all of what Gavin Newsom is performative, not performance-based. And that's why he thinks he can run for president via podcast while his state is still in shambles.
So, Susan, we hear this view, particularly from conservatives, quite a lot about how Democrats have ruined California and made it a dystopia, in your judgment. Last November, Kamala Harris carried the state by 20 points. Newsom, after the pandemic in 2022, won re-election by 19 points. So if the Democratic Party is the problem, why do Californians not agree?
Because it's a one-party state now.
Republicans can run, can they not?
What? They can run.
And they lose, generally, do they not?
Absolutely. The independents are growing, and Donald Trump made inroads. So he had actually 6 million to Kamala Harris's 9 million, which was like 2 million greater than last time around. So there are some trends that it's turning right. There's a rightward trend across the state. And you see in Los Angeles and San Francisco, they both kicked out their lenient on crime prosecutors, and they passed a big crackdown on crime, getting rid of some of Gavin Newsom's policies and George Gascon, the LA prosecutors' policies that were so soft on crime that it led to all these smash and grab robberies across the states. So we do see a trend. There's a chance. It'll depend on who runs for governor. And we know Kamala Harris is already in the running and she's leading the polls. But we need a breakout candidate, a Republican candidate, to really challenge her and make sure that she's being held, her feet are being held to the fire. And we already hear some rumblings that Rick Grinnell might be one of those, and a very very popular sheriff in Riverside County named Bianco is also going to be running.
What do you make of Gavin Newsom seeming to pivot recently to the right? Just talking with Charlie, trying to make common cause with Charlie Kirk, a very popular conservative commentator, saying that he agrees with the not even the conservative view, the majority view on trans women competing in women's sports. Does he have some kind of perception that he should come off as more moderate or something like that? And has it showed up in any of his policies?
It absolutely has not showed up in any of his policies. That's the perfect question. He's basically performative. He's not, he likes to say things that sound good, but when you look at his policies, had Representative Ro Khanna asking him yesterday on Fox News, so what are you changing about this 2013 law that allows trans athletes, biological men, to participate in women's sports and girls' sports in high school? And I wrote a piece last week that his wife, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, she was participating and partnering with a pro-trans athletes in high school sports group, nonprofit, just late last month. So I asked his office if there was any change whatsoever in his policies, and they just pointed to his comments with Charlie Kirk on his podcast. They had nothing new to add.
Susan, in terms of the broader case that you're making, it is quite commonplace to say the faults that exist in California are an indictment of Democratic leadership, which I think is your point. And I know this is a big topic to get into as an almost final question, but it seems to me that argument is made almost exclusively about Democratic-run states. And I was looking at the state rankings for states. U.S. News and World Report happens to do one ranking. And the state of Mississippi is 50th in the economy, 50th in health, 48th in infrastructure, 35th in education. Why is that never cited as an indictment of Republican rule, but California is cited as an indictment of Democratic rule?
Well, that's an interesting concept. You don't have a lot of people, you have a mass exodus from last time I checked out of Mississippi. You have so many people leaving. During Gavin Newsom's, this is the first time that you've had such an exodus out of the state.
But my point, hold on, you can't just measure a state's performance purely on the basis of population flows. There are things like quality of life. There are things like educational standards and health standards. My point is, when there are Republican-led states that have obviously enormous problems, why is that never held as an indictment of Republican policy?
I am taking a look at California. So my belief system is that you have to
take a look at the Democratic Party from a critical perspective, no?
I am looking at California, so I am looking at my state. I actually live here, and it has been a transformation since I grew up in the 80s and 90s here. And it is what I feel like is we have so many poor standards when it comes to education as well. So we are, there's not a lot of things except for we do have a good economy. Gavin Newsom likes to say that, but what we do have record, especially during the pandemic, we had record unemployment here as well. So I think you're making a good point, but that's not something that we took a look at in this book. We're looking at what is happening with California and why are the policies being exported across the country. And why does Gavin Newsom think that he can run when he spent $24 billion on homelessness? He can't account for it, and it's getting worse.
Right. The trajectory of California's fate being, I think, what you're paying some attention to from a place where so many wealthy and bright people chose to live, and whether that will continue to be the case. Susan Crabtree, sounds like a fascinating book. Look forward to reading it. Thank you so much for coming on Rising.
Appreciate it, Robby. Thanks for having me.
Up next, Paramount has had a change of mind over whether it will defend CBS News against Trump's lawsuit. We'll discuss. Trump's battle with the media continues. Paramount filed 2 motions Thursday to dismiss a $20 billion lawsuit that Trump had brought in October.
The lawsuit alleges that 60 Minutes deceptively edited an interview with then presidential candidate, Vice President Kamala Harris. Trump argues that this was voter interference. One of the motions reads, quote, "They not only ask for $20 billion in damages, but also seek an order directing how a news organization may exercise its editorial judgment in the future. The First Amendment stands resolutely against these demands."
Trump's attorney, Ed Pautzig, told Axios President Trump is committed to holding those who traffic in fake news, hoaxes, and lies to account. CBS and Paramount committed the worst kind of election interference and fraud in the closing days of the most important presidential election in history. CBS also says the case should be dismissed for improper venue and also lack of personal and subject matter jurisdiction. Network wants the case to move to the Southern District of New York.
Last month, CBS had agreed to release the full unedited video of 60 Minutes' interview with Harris.
In case you need a refresher, let's show you both 60-minute clips side by side. Here's the edited version that aired on TV.
But it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not listening.
We're not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end.
Here is the unedited version that the FCC released alongside CBS.
But it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not listening. The Wall Street Journal said that that your administration has repeatedly been blindsided by Netanyahu. And in fact, he has rebuffed just about all of your administration's entreaties.
Well, Bill, the work that we have done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region. And we're not going to stop doing that. We're not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end.
Amid all this, Paramount is awaiting regulatory approval for its merger with Skydance Media.
Last week, Oliver Darcy reported in his newsletter, Status, that pressure from Paramount executives was ramping up and that they wanted to settle the case. CBS heads pushed back and felt it would be a bad and embarrassing move if they did so.
So we've talked about this a number of times, and
Yes.
my standpoint has not changed. I don't think the lawsuit should have been brought. I don't think it constitutes election interference. I think it is under CBS's purview to editorialize and cut interviews the way they want, and it's their free speech rights, and they can do that, and you can be mad about it and criticize it, as I think it is fair to do. I simultaneously think the way this interview was edited was bad. I don't think Kamala Harris's answer was very good in either version, but the clipped version omitted a number of just not true things she was saying. I mean, maybe you could debate how true they are about how much we were able to push Israel to change its policy. She was saying, "Oh, they did a lot of things differently," which is not really the case. And then they cut to the part of her saying, "We're going to continue to make them do that." I think omitting that part was bad, especially because it was in between him he asked a question and then she said a bunch of stuff and then that thing, and they took out that part. I don't think they should have done it, but they have the right to do it.
I don't think it was deceptive editing. I think that's where we disagree. We have elements of.
I don't think it was necessarily deliberately deceptive. I think it.
I mean, she made a claim that the Biden administration frequently makes and made at that time about its influence over Israel. I don't think her point was correct. I don't think that the Biden administration really wrung any very significant concessions from Israel, and I've been very
Right.
critical of their stance. But I don't think that her answer in either the edited or unedited version was. I don't think one was even particularly worse than the other. I think they were both rather vague answers. But my bigger point is the edit is, to my mind, completely standard journalistic practice. Obviously, when you do longer form interviews, those are frequently condensed for broadcast purposes. And the question is how you condense them in a way that is fair to both interviewer and interviewee, and can you do it in a way that just cuts off, let's say, verbosity or extraneous comments or whatever. The anchor there, I noticed, didn't ask the question especially concisely in the unedited version, and they shaved a bit off that. I think that's completely valid. I also think to this point that Paramount seeking the dismissal of the case, the Trump team took this case under a very peculiar pretext, which is a Texas law about deceptive practices or something. I think that was pretty clearly venue shopping, court shopping, and I'm very glad that Paramount is now pushing to dismiss it. I would have been worried just from a journalistic perspective if they had bowed the knee to expedite some sort of other broader business interest.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the Texas law is probably unconstitutional, and so this could be if this gets to the Supreme Court, we could find out that law doesn't even should not be in effect. Yeah, obviously, editing has to take place. It kind of depends. How much editing is allowed sort of depends on what in terms of journalistic standard practice, on what the medium is. In print, when you got to condense someone's quote to like 2 sentences, you're going to do a heavier level of editing, but make sure the quote you're using represents the larger thing that they said. In a longer interview, this was a longer interview. To me, the point, they cut, right, he asked the question, and there's some stuff she said, and they cut out the part right after he asks the question. I would have been a little bit more careful there. I don't think it's the greatest transgression or crime ever committed. I don't think it should be sued over, certainly. Yeah. But I would not have left out the part where she says, "Oh no, we pushed Netanyahu to do all sorts of things differently," but they didn't. They didn't.
I mean, I just don't see it as nefarious at all. I, like I say, have expressed disagreement numerous times with the policy that they pursued on that issue. But I don't think that the edited version of her answer misrepresented what the full answer was. I think it was a fairly condensed version. I also think that we can go back and forth about that precise answer and what precise sentences were clipped from it. But the big picture here is, in my view, Trump seeking to intimidate media by mounting vexatious legal cases against them.
Well, the solution to all of this is for people to get their news from unfiltered, unedited sources like ours. There's no clipping in our interviews when we bring somebody on. We don't edit out any part of their answer. You get the whole thing, and that's it's something to be said for the podcast model where you just talk to someone for hours and you don't cut up anything that they say.
Absolutely.
And even if it's more of a rough or unfinished product, there are advantages to that as well.
The unexpurgated truth.
Indeed. That does it for us today on Rising. Thanks so much for tuning in, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. For those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can get podcasts. Tomorrow and the next day, it's Marianne Williamson, and the day after that, Linda Tran. I got a whole schedule now of guest hosts coming through. Niall will be back on Friday, I believe.
Yep.
See you later.